Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Your Mark on the World show. I'm your host, Devin Thorpe, and we're producing this episode for Forbes, where I'm a contributor covering social entrepreneurship and impact investing. Our guest today is Dr. Jean Rogers, who is the CEO of the SASB. Jean, thank you very much for joining us today.
So pleased to be here. Thank you, Devin.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. You're doing some really interesting work, and I think what you're doing is becoming more and more relevant, more and more in demand, more and more the focus of attention. Tell us about what you're doing.
Well, at SASB, we develop standards for companies to disclose their sustainability impacts, which is essentially their environmental and social impacts, right alongside their financial impacts. And our standards are relevant for all publicly traded companies.
It is really a huge shift in the last 20 years to think about companies including this stuff. When I was in business school back in the olden days, this was not on the radar.
Mm-hmm.
This was hippies at Berkeley worrying about this. Not anymore. What's going on that's driving the demand for your service?
You know, I think it's sort of a perfect storm, if you will. There's a number of factors that are converging that are megatrends. It is climate change and the effect that that has on businesses and even on entire industries and their outlook. It is population growth and the pressures that that places on society and the need for products and services. And it is also resource constraints that result from that population growth. These factors are increasingly material not only to businesses but to investors as well as society. And the work that we're doing is really helping to make sense of that so that both companies and investors know what matters, when is it material, how do I make sense of this, how do I begin to manage and measure my performance on these factors that are material to the business.
Jean, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but I hope you can help me think through with a little bit of specificity.
Sure.
Give us something you're comfortable talking about, but a metric that you have figured out a way to measure. Give us one example, and then let's talk about how it's measured.
Mm-hmm.
And display.
Sure. So the first thing we do is approach it from an industry perspective. So we start with a broad range of issues, and we prioritize what are the most important factors. And that's from looking very simplistically at how companies use resources to deliver their products and services to market, and then what impacts they will have on society and the environment. So the topics that we address are very different, for example, in healthcare or oil and gas or banking. They each have their unique profile of the types of things that are likely to be material. So, for example, in healthcare, the kinds of things that are in our standards are related oftentimes to the social impacts. That makes sense. That's an industry that has significant effects on society. So they'll be related to things like safety of clinical trials or counterfeit drugs getting into the supply chain or the distribution chain, or related to access to services and pricing. And so each topic that is considered material would then have their own specific disclosure. And disclosures really are simply a company telling their story to investors about how well they're positioned, how well they're managing that risk, and what their performance is, ideally, on that particular topic. If we look at something like non-renewable resources, then we're dealing with more environmental factors and the amount of resources that companies use to, say, the amount of water used to produce a certain amount of minerals that they're mining, or in the case of oil and gas, the amount of reserves that may be unburnable due to the risk of limits on climate change. So every industry has its very unique profile. The topics are highly relevant to business. In fact, they're tied to the business models and how they use resources. And the disclosures are very specific.
So I'm still trying to get a grip on a specific example. So let's take Coca-Cola and water. Can we talk about Coca-Cola and water? What kinds of disclosures and would they be expected to make under your standards, and how does Coca-Cola use your standards to make those disclosures fairly, accurately, and according to the rules?
That's a great example of a topic that is material in the food and beverage industry, in which Coca-Cola is with its peers. And actually, Coca-Cola already discusses water use as a material risk factor in its public disclosures to the Securities and Exchange Commission. It is one of the companies who is very far ahead in acknowledging these types of risks to their business and disclosing it to investors. So a typical example of a water-related metric in food and beverage would be how much water is used per liter of product produced. How much water did it actually take, besides the water that ends up in that liter? How much did it take to actually produce that? And are there practices in place to recycle that wastewater and to preserve or protect the water resource or the aquifer? In other words, what we're really trying to get at is how dependent is Coca-Cola or other companies on the water reserves. Are those reserves scarce? And so they also need to disclose how much of their operations draw water from resource-constrained areas, and then how much water per volume of product do they actually use, which is really is an efficiency metric and indicates not only an actual resource use and whether or not they're at risk from constraints, but it's also an indication of management quality and how closely they're paying attention to these material factors.
What % of companies are now saying in their reporting, or is this a fair measure, but are they saying in their reporting to the SEC, we're following the SASB standards for our industry and here's our report?
Mm-hmm. Not just yet, Devin, and it's a little bit early for that. The standards that we've released so far, which is we're about 6/10 of the way done. Our world is divided into 10 sectors. 6 of them are now released for provisional use, and they're the first draft of this new market infrastructure. So 6 out of the 10 sectors have provisional standards. This is the period of time in which we're engaging with companies, having a dialogue about the cost benefit, looking very carefully at the metrics and the topics, making sure that they are both useful for management and useful for investors and analysts, and that we've really hit on the right topics and the right metrics. So the ones that are out in provisional form are being piloted now, and they're ready for use and feedback during this time that we're evaluating cost benefit. As soon as we get the full set done, which is about another 4 to 5 quarters from now, so Q1 2016, we'll have the full set of provisional standards out in the market. Then we'll finalize them, and that's when we'll really begin to see them incorporated into the 10K disclosures. But I think it's important to also note that these topics are not new topics for company, like water use that you mentioned for Coca-Cola. Companies are already grappling with these issues, and oftentimes they're already disclosing them, even in their 10K, which is the mandatory filing that all publicly listed companies do about their performance. And our research shows that about 65% of the topics that we cover in terms of setting standards are already disclosed by companies in their 10K, but about half of that is boilerplate language. So they're recognizing it as a risk. They're making a statement to protect themselves from omission of something material, but they're not providing decision useful information. In some cases, they may not even have good information to be managing that material issue. Certainly, they're not disclosing it. And that's really what our goal is here. Let's improve the quality of that disclosure, make it be decision useful related to performance so that investor can compare, say, Coke versus Pepsi on more than just taste, more than just profit, and look at how efficient they are, how well positioned they are. But also, when you begin to have disclosures that incorporate a performance element, companies begin to drive that performance, especially when it's in a public eye. And so that's really what we'll be monitoring to see how well is disclosure going to improve from, now that we have standards in place, from boilerplate to something that's really useful and very tangible.
Let's talk a little bit about what's driving this, because I think the SEC does not yet specifically require sustainability disclosures. However, there does seem to be some implied or implicit legal obligation to disclose things about this, in part because more and more people are disclosing, and the absence of disclosure on these topics now becomes an apparent breach. Well, how would you explain what's going on in this way?
Well, there is increased pressure to disclose these factors, and I think this is highly correlated to the fact that they're becoming more material. They're becoming increasingly material to investors. We see shareholder resolutions on the rise. We see a practice called questionnaires and questionnaire fatigue on the part of companies that's on the rise from investors increasingly seeking this type of information from companies because it's not disclosed in a business as usual type of way through the normal channels. So they don't have access to it. And so it's being driven by demand. But the really interesting thing, Devin, is that there already is a regulation in place that governs disclosure of material factors. It's called Regulation SK, and it is something that governs disclosure from companies to the SEC, and it does not distinguish between financial and non-financial information. Basically, any information that's material to an investor needs to be disclosed by companies, and Regulation SK sets that forth. And so the SEC will say, and have said on several occasions and in guidance documents, that for an example, for climate change, they put out a guidance document in 2010 and said, you know what, it could be material, it's important to look at, Regulation SK governs this, if it's material, you need to disclose it, think about it. And they put out a guidance document that clarified, hey, if it's material to your industry, you better be disclosing it. So the law is actually already there. What isn't so clear is an understanding of what's material, and then of course the standards to disclose are missing. We have very good standards on the financial side, how to disclose profit and revenue and so forth, but on the non-financial side, that's where SASB comes in. So the law's there, as we like to say, the law's on our side, and we're putting the standards in place to comply. Now
the FASB works with a formal mandate from the SEC, as I understand.
Yes, that is correct.
Do you hope to someday have the same kind of mandate from the SEC?
Well, I think there are pros and cons to that. That would literally take an act of Congress, as they say, to do that. You're accurate in saying that the FASB operates with a mandate, which is that companies must use their standards to disclose financials. They must use US GAAP and the FASB approach. Now, with our standards, they must comply with the law, they can do that in any way. They don't have to use SASB standards currently. But in the absence of standards, our approach is a pretty good way to make sure that you are complying with regulation SK for these topics that are less well understood, sometimes controversial. Difficult to know how far to go on disclosure. Companies are always concerned about being put at a competitive disadvantage. They want a level playing field. So the SASB standards are a really good way to help companies say something decision useful and yet not go too far to comply with the law. As for a mandate, that would be a long time in the future if it were to go in that pathway. For now, we are a very helpful set of standards for companies to comply with the existing law, but they are voluntary for companies to adopt. On the other hand, given that that law exists, and we've had over 2,000 participants now in our standard setting process, about a third companies, a third investors, and a third other stakeholders, that's a pretty broad swath of market participation that have indicated, yes, these are topics that are likely to be material. Yes, we can use a standard on it. And yes, that's a good metric. So there's there's sort of a groundswell of market support for the idea of having a standard, which can be very helpful when it's a new topic and you want to go just far enough in your disclosure that is helpful, but not too far that you're disclosing more than you need to.
Yeah. We're running out of time, Jean, but I want to ask you a few quick thought questions before we go.
Sure.
So first, you're a brilliant woman, but everybody has tough days, especially on those tough days. Where do you go for inspiration? Who do you look to as a role model?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think on those tough days, of course, it's my family. I have an 8-year-old daughter. She's an incredible inspiration to me and has been really very supportive of SASB and of what we're doing. And I often look to others that have great courage and fortitude in accomplishing things that they're passionate about. And so, I really come back to oftentimes words that really founded the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the idea of transparency, and Justice Brandeis, who did a lot of the writing and thinking that ended up creating the Securities and Exchange Commission. And while he's most famous for talking about sunlight as being, a great disinfectant, I believe were his words, and it's something that is even more profound when you understand his also commitment to the right to privacy. And I think that what we're doing is really an evolution of the great precepts that our markets were founded on, and continuing to drive efficient capital markets to protect investors and to have great standards that continue to support the breadth and liquidity of our capital markets that we've become accustomed to take for granted in a way. So we're really evolving our market infrastructure to account for the critical dimensions of sustainability we face today. And I'm really proud to be a part of that evolution and to continue to strengthen the information that not only investors rely upon, but our society relies upon. And so those are some of my role models. And of course, if you're doing this for real and care about social impact, you can't underestimate having a supportive family that allows you to talk about things over the dinner table that maybe they would rather not talk about materiality over their turkey dinner, but we do that.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad someone does.
Yeah.
Listen, before we go, give us one tip for doing more good in the world. Could you do that?
Well, I think, one tip for doing more good in the world is to realize that it's not easy and to not get frustrated. I think Shakespeare actually had a wonderful quote on this in The Merchant of Venice, and that's if to do were as easy as to know what were good to do, then chapels would be churches and poor men's cottages, princes' palaces. And you can't ever take it for granted that just because you have a powerful idea and people get behind it and see the value of it, that it's going to be an easy road. It takes an incredible amount of fortitude and people around you that are supportive. And I think it's just important to give it that time and remember that it's not easy. If it were easy, it would be done. And everything in life that's worth doing is typically not easy. And give yourself a break. It's not going to happen overnight. And stick to it. As my dad used to say, stick-to-itiveness is one of the most important qualities to have in life, and seeing yourself through these challenges.
I get that. Thank you. That's a great tip. Now, before we wrap up, I know we'll have piqued some interest from people who probably weren't familiar with SASB before tonight. Tell us how people can connect to learn more.
Well, probably the best way is to either go to our website, www.sasb.org, or to connect with us through Twitter @SASB, or info@sasb.org. Those are all great ways to get connected. You can participate in working groups. They're free. We still have 2 sectors remaining that have the working groups going on. And we take public comments at any time. Just come to our website on any of the standards while we're in provisional phase, at least for another year. Bring it on. We want comments on the ones that are already out, suggestions for the ones that are not done yet. We truly value and want engagement from the public, and particularly from capital markets participants. So get involved. These standards are for the markets and for society, and as we say at SASB, we're accounting for a sustainable future. We need everybody involved.
Fantastic. Well, again, Jean, thank you very much for being with us today. We wish you every success in rolling out your new standards.
Thank you, Devin. It's my pleasure.
All right.
Take care.
Let's do some good.